somewhere in the flat, unremarkable farmland between the French cities of Tours and Poitiers, in a field that today grows wheat and sunflowers and attracts no tourists and bears no monument adequate to what may have happened there, the entire future of Western civilization hung suspended in the October air of 732 AD for approximately 7 days before it crashed down on one side of history rather than the other. And the reason I say may have happened is the first thing you need to understand about this battle, the first thread you need to pull before the entire comfortable mythology begins to unravel, because the Battle of Tours, or Poitiers, depending on which tradition you inherit, has been described by historians from Edward Gibbon in the 18th century to contemporary popular writers as the battle that saved Christian Europe. The hinge upon which the entire subsequent history of Western civilization turned, the moment when the Umayyad advance that had consumed North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula and crossed the Pyrenees, was finally broken by a Frankish warlord named Charles, a man who earned the surname Martel, the Hammer, specifically because of what he did in that field on that October morning. And yet, when you go to the primary sources, when you sit with the actual documents that contemporaries and near-contemporaries produced about this engagement, you find something deeply disorienting. You find that the battle is described with a brevity and a casualness in the Frankish chronicles that sits in violent contrast to the world historical significance that later generations have loaded onto it. The continuations of Fredegar, the closest thing to a contemporary Frankish account, dispatches the entire engagement in a few sentences, and the Arabic sources are similarly compressed, and the death toll figures that later historians cite with confidence, figures like 360,000 Muslim dead, are so obviously fantastical that they tell you more about the mythological needs of the civilizations doing the counting than about anything that actually happened in that field. And so the central question of this story is not merely military, it is epistemological. It is about the gap between what happened and what we have decided happened. It is about how a battle becomes a myth, and what that myth reveals about the civilization that needs it. And it is about whether the world that emerged from October 732 was shaped more by what Charles Martel actually did, or by the story that the centuries after him invented about what he had done. To understand Charles Martel, you must first excavate him from the monument that his descendants built over him, because the Carolingian dynasty that produced Charlemagne had every political incentive to retroactively transform its founding figure into a providential hero of civilization. And the Charles that emerges when you strip away that retrospective mythologizing is a considerably more complex and morally ambiguous figure than the gleaming hammer of Christendom that the textbooks tend to present. He was not a king. He was a mayor of the palace, the de facto ruler of the Frankish kingdoms at a time when the Merovingian kings he nominally served had been so completely hollowed out of real power that historians call them the rois fainéants, the do-nothing kings, phantoms of royal legitimacy maintained on their thrones by men like Charles precisely because a puppet king is more useful than no king when you need theological and traditional cover for your own authority, and Charles had seized that authority through a vicious civil war within the Frankish aristocracy that left corpses across the whole political landscape of what is now France and Germany and the Low Countries. He was illegitimate by birth, the son of his father, Pepin of Herstal, by a concubine rather than a legal wife, which meant that his claim to the mayoralty was contested from the moment of his father's death in 714 by the legitimate heirs and their aristocratic backers, and he spent the years between 714 and roughly 720 in a series of military campaigns against internal Frankish enemies that were every bit as brutal as anything he would later do against external ones. And the church, which later traditions celebrate as the institution that Charles defended at Tours, had a deeply complicated relationship with him, because one of Charles' principal methods of financing his military operations was the seizure of church lands and their redistribution to his warriors as reward for loyalty, a practice that made him enemies in the ecclesiastical hierarchy that would simmer and occasionally boil over for the remainder of his life. And into this already turbulent political landscape, from the south came the Umayyad forces, and here too the mythology requires immediate surgical complication. The force that crossed the Pyrenees under the command of Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi in 732 was not, as the mythology tends to present it, a monolithic army of religious conquest driving northward with the explicit strategic objective of Islamizing Europe. It was substantially a raiding force, large and well-organized and dangerous, but operating within the raiding logic of the period. The same logic that drove Viking expeditions, that drove Frankish raids into neighboring territories, the logic of extracting portable wealth from rich targets and returning with it, and the extraordinarily wealthy shrine complex of St. Martin at Tours, one of the most sacred and therefore most lavishly endowed pilgrimage sites in Western Christendom, was the specific target that drew Abd al-Rahman's force so far north. And understanding this changes the military and historical meaning of what followed, because Charles did not intercept a civilizational juggernaut aimed at the heart of Europe. He intercepted a raiding force that was heavily laden with plunder from Bordeaux and the surrounding region, and that was therefore less mobile and more vulnerable than the Umayyad armies that had conquered Iberia a generation earlier. And the engagement itself, when it finally came, after days of the two forces watching each other across a narrowing gap of autumn farmland, was almost certainly not the set-piece pitched battle of legend, but something messier and more contingent. The Frankish forces fighting in the dense formation their chroniclers call a wall of ice or a wall of iron, the Umayyad cavalry repeatedly failing to break that formation, and then, critically, a rumor or a report spreading through the Umayyad ranks that Frankish raiders were attacking their camp, and the plunder accumulated over weeks of campaigning, and when portions of the Umayyad force turned back toward the camp, the withdrawal collapsed into a rout. Abd al-Rahman was killed in the fighting, and Charles held the field, and the field was his, and the mythology machine began immediately. Now the uncomfortable excavation that this story demands, the layer beneath the mythology that neither the celebratory Western tradition nor the simplified counter-narrative fully acknowledges, concerns what Tours actually was and was not in the context of the Umayyad presence in Europe. Because the battle did not end the Umayyad presence in Western Europe, it did not drive the Umayyad forces back. Across the Pyrenees in a single decisive stroke, it checked one raiding expedition, and the Umayyad forces continued to operate in significant portions of southern France for years afterward, controlling the city of Narbonne until 759, a full 27 years after Tours, and Charles himself conducted multiple further campaigns into the south, campaigns that the Western tradition remembers as liberation, but that the populations of Provence and Languedoc sometimes experienced rather differently. Because Charles's military methods in the south included a scorched earth brutality that his own chroniclers record with a matter-of-factness that should disturb the reader, he burned cities and destroyed agricultural infrastructure on a scale that a 9th century chronicler described as leaving Provence so devastated that it lay depopulated for years. And the populations of those regions, many of whom had developed accommodation and sometimes genuine cultural exchange with the Umayyad administration, in ways that parallel what we have already seen in Iberia, were not always the grateful liberated Christians of the Carolingian propaganda, but people who found themselves caught between two military powers and damaged by both. And then there is the theological reading of Tours that requires the most careful handling. The tradition of interpreting the battle as divine providence, as a moment when God intervened to preserve a particular civilization, a reading that was not merely medieval piety, but that has had a long and sometimes toxic afterlife in Western political thought, surfacing in 19th century nationalist historiography, in 20th century clash of civilizations frameworks, and in 21st century far-right political movements that invoke Tours and Poitiers as rallying symbols, stripping the event entirely of its historical complexity and loading it with an ideological charge that the actual participants on both sides, men fighting over plunder and power in an October field, would not have recognized or understood. What Tours left behind is not a clean historical verdict, but a question that the intervening 13 centuries have made more complicated rather than less, because the historians who have spent the most time with the primary sources tend toward a cautious deflation of the battle's significance, pointing out that the Umayyad expansion in Western Europe was already reaching its natural logistical limits, that the Pyrenees represented a genuine strategic barrier, that the Caliphate in Damascus was too distant and too administratively stretched to project decisive force across indefinitely, that Tours may have accelerated an outcome that geography and politics were already making inevitable, rather than being the singular pivot point that the mythology requires. And yet the deflationists face their own problem, which is that history is not only what happened, but what people believed happened and how those beliefs shaped subsequent action. And the belief that Tours was a decisive, providential moment shaped Carolingian self-understanding, shaped the alliance between the Frankish monarchy and the papacy that produced the coronation of Charlemagne in 800, and therefore the entire subsequent architecture of medieval Western Christendom, shaped the intellectual and political framework within which Europe understood its own identity for centuries, and in that sense the myth of Tours, regardless of the military reality of Tours, was one of the most consequential myths in Western history, a story that a civilization told itself about who it was and what it had survived, and what it was therefore destined to be. And the problem with such myths is not that they are false, it is that they are selectively true, that they require the erasure of everything that complicates the clean line of the story, the Umayyad scholars preserving Greek texts that European libraries had lost the cultural exchange in the borderlands, the Frankish atrocities in Provence, the plunder logic underlying both sides of the engagement. And today, when the Battle of Tours appears in political discourse, it almost never appears as a complex medieval military engagement of debated significance. It appears as a symbol, weaponized, simplified, stripped of its humanity on all sides and loaded with the specific ideological needs of whoever is invoking it. And that transformation of history into symbol is itself the thing that should alarm you most, because a civilization that cannot look at its own foundational myths with clear eyes and ask what they are hiding is a civilization that has handed control of its future to its most convenient fictions. And the flat French farmland between Tours and Poitiers is still there, still growing wheat and sunflowers, still bearing no monument adequate to the weight that has been placed upon it, and it offers no verdict, it has no opinion. It simply lies there in the autumn light, asking the question that all contested ground eventually asks of the people who stand upon it and argue about what it means, which is this: if you need a single battle to explain who you are, what does that need reveal about everything you are afraid to examine about yourself? And what version of history are you prepared to bury in order to keep the myth intact? And what will you do when the buried things refuse to stay down?